Wellbeing for Education Return is intended to help local areas to support schools and further education providers to promote wellbeing and good mental health. It's specifically designed to respond to the impacts of the pandemic. My name is Dr. Reena Bajaj. I'm a counselling psychologist and I'm the head of training for the Mental Health and Wellbeing in Schools team at the Anna Freud National Centre for Children and Families, which is a training provider for the Wellbeing for Education Return programme. We've developed this webinar drawing on the feedback and experience of a range of education and mental health leaders and experts, education unions, charities and local areas and their leads who have been delivering wellbeing for education return training and support. It focuses on one key message: every interaction matters. It seeks to draw on your existing abilities to connect with and support others in your existing roles. The webinar is intended to support an all-staff session, ideally facilitated by a senior leader with experience in pastoral, well-being, mental health or safeguarding issues, in a staff meeting or an inset day. The webinar is designed to be interactive with a suggested activity towards the end. The session should take about 45 to 60 minutes. You can also read through this on your own before discussing it as a group. Now let's get started. Please press play on the next slide. Adults, children and young people alike will have been affected by this pandemic, and the principles we cover here apply across all ages. It's important to remember care and compassion for each other and for yourselves. We know education staff work incredibly hard, and we recognise that this pandemic has brought challenging and uncertain circumstances which have greatly affected teachers, support staff, and of course children and young people and their families. Now more than ever, it's important to take care of and support your own well-being as well as the well-being of children and young people. We know this isn't easy, but there are straightforward things that you can do that can help. You all have an important role in your pupils' and students' lives, particularly when other parts of their lives might be challenging, such as their home or family circumstances. We know from extensive research that even one good, secure relationship with a teacher or a similar figure can be protective in the longer term. It can also improve the longer-term outcomes of children and young people, particularly those from vulnerable backgrounds. Those pupils and students that you might have considered to be vulnerable before the pandemic, such as those with learning disabilities or autism, those with a social worker, with mental health needs, those living in poverty, experiencing or witnessing neglect or abuse, and young carers, may well have greater well-being needs than their peers. Some children, young people and/or their parents or carers are at risk of experiencing discrimination due to race, class, disability, gender or sexuality, and they also may be more seriously affected by the pandemic. Whatever children and young people might be going through, a connection with a known trusted adult can make all of the difference. Many schools and further education providers are taking a holistic approach to well-being and mental health. It's about how together you can promote well-being and mental health within your community, while still being alert to the signs of more serious issues and ensuring those pupils and students who need it can access the right support quickly. So it's about the overall ethos and environment, the curriculum, staff development and well-being, the voice of pupils, students and staff engagement of parents and carers, with leaders and managers championing emotional health and well-being. Whatever your community's strengths and wherever your community is up to, together you can support each other and your students. This slide provides the key learning objectives for this Wellbeing for Education Return webinar. This webinar will introduce some key messages and models for all ages. It will clarify what's meant by the terms well-being and resilience. It will introduce and cover a simple evidence-based framework for supporting children, young people and adults alike within the current context. This framework is look, listen, link. There will also be a suggested activity for you to engage with. As this webinar has an interactive element, it's recommended that the person facilitating this session helps you to develop a short group agreement like the one outlined on this slide. This can help to create a safe space to reflect and explore on how you may all share and apply what you've learned. These are some suggestions. Your facilitator can check with the group to make sure that everyone's okay with these suggestions, and this also provides an opportunity for adding or changing the agreement accordingly. Let's start by covering relationships, interactions, and well-being. If there is one message we want you to take away from this webinar, it's that every interaction with another person is an intervention. This message and supporting research was developed by the clinical psychologist Dr. Karen Treisman in 2017. Every interaction is an opportunity to grow, learn and develop, and this can help to build resilience. In a school or further education context, everyone has a role to play, from teaching staff to reception to security to lunchtime supervisors. Every interaction is important and can help pupils and students to build relationships with trusted adults in the school or further education environment. This is especially important in helping to make the school or further education provider a safe space for children and young people to share how they're feeling and to access support. This applies online as well as offline. With your heavy workloads, you might feel like you haven't got enough time to give to everyone who may need it, including yourself. It's particularly important at the moment to support our own well-being, as well as the well-being of pupils and students. This isn't always easy, and not everyone feels able or confident to get into a conversation about mental health related issues. But don't underestimate the power of the little things. Making eye contact, the facial expressions you use, how you actively listen, how you show empathy, what you say and how you say it. Even a general conversation, the way you greet or thank someone or ask how they are, can really make a difference. Remember that every positive interaction is an intervention in itself. This is backed up by neuroscience research by Donald Hebb and others, which shows how our brains grow and develop through relationships and form habits. Habits that nurture resilience and support well-being lead to growth. There are various different ways to describe and experience well-being, but there's a general consensus on what it is. Here, we've used the Department of Health and Social Care's definition, which is feeling good and functioning well. Broken down, well-being broadly means our physical, mental and emotional health. Good well-being is also usually indicative of a good balance in life. Good social relationships are also very important when it comes to our well-being. There are also various ways and tools you can use to measure staff, pupil and student well-being. Resilience might be less of a familiar concept than well-being. It's important to be clear what we're talking about with resilience so that everyone has a shared language and understanding. Resilience and well-being are linked, but resilience means more than well-being. Resilience includes the capacity to recover from setbacks quickly and cope well with life's challenges. So to move forward, as well as bounce back or even bounce forward after experiencing difficulties. More resilience is generally linked to improving well-being, and well-being helps learning and growth that leads to greater resilience. If your whole school or further education community is resilient, that can also support personal resilience and vice versa. This slide highlights a range of things that help us to become more resilient. As you can see, relationships are key when we think about resilience. We may already know some of these things, but it's helpful to remind ourselves of the opportunities we have to interact and build our own and other people's resilience, or perhaps just point people to sources of support or activities that might help them. It's important that we draw on most or all of these things to support and build resilience. When we think about resilience and building relationships, and before we introduce you to Look, Listen and Link, there are a few things to consider as outlined here. You may currently be delivering both online and classroom learning and support. You may also be working with pupils and students that you don't know very well. You may also be doing all of these things whilst trying to homeschool your own children or caring for other friends and family. These newer ways of working can pose challenges as well as opportunities. For example, having access to technology or having a private space and enough time to talk. If you're looking to check in with a parent or carer, a pupil or student, or even a staff member, establish whether those involved have the time and space to speak, if they understand what the conversation is about, and if they have a time limit around how long the call will take. It's important to be mindful of what else might be going on for children and young people, as well as what might be going on for parents and carers and staff members. People will be affected in different ways and may therefore need different or extra kinds of help in accessing support. It's important that you act within your own competency and role. You may be facing some really challenging situations with pupils and students, but also challenging situations with staff and parents or carers, particularly at the moment. It's really natural to want to help, but you don't have to have all of the answers. If you're not a mental health expert, you're not expected to be. Remember that we're all human and this is a particularly challenging time. When we're trying to spot and support other people who are struggling, it's important, especially now, for us to put our own safety masks on first. If you don't feel confident or emotionally able to address a concern, that's completely understandable. Someone else might be better placed to offer this support. If in doubt, discuss this with your safeguarding, pastoral, well-being or senior mental health lead. Use your own support networks if you need to. It's also important to respect and protect the child or young person. Involving a child's parents or carers depends on their age and the situation, but it's best to engage them wherever appropriate. If a young person is over the age of 16, then the information they share with you is confidential, and you cannot share this with anyone unless you have a reason to suspect risk of harm to themselves or others, or they have given you permission to share information. If the child is under 16, then you need to ensure that they understand that depending on what they tell you, you may need to pass that on to other people to keep them safe. Make sure you're up to date on and follow your school or further education providers' safeguarding and child protection policies and procedures, including how these work in teaching or interacting with children and young people online, and that you know how to respond if a child or a young person tells you something isn't right at home. This slide introduces Look, Listen, Link. This is drawn from psychological first aid, which has a global evidence base. It was developed as a way to reduce distress following traumatic events, and it also helps individuals to support people of all ages to function and cope better. It focuses on some key actions: look, listen, link, as a simple framework for identifying and approaching someone in distress, assessing what help they might need, and enabling them to get that help. It's a useful framework for the current context and for staff working in schools and further education because it's focused on supporting people to recover in the shorter term and to build resilience in the longer term by learning from their experiences. You may also have heard about or trained in mental health first aid or awareness. Whilst there might be some overlap, psychological first aid is not the same as mental health first aid training. This is specifically about providing practical, emotional support following potentially stressful or traumatic incidents. It may be helpful during and after this pandemic and in responding to events linked to it, such as bereavement, illness, or injury. If you're interested in learning more about using psychological first aid in your work with children and young people, we've linked to e-learning on this in the signposting document alongside this webinar. This slide provides an overview of the first part of the psychological first aid model, which is look. The slide highlights some warning signs and what to look out for when supporting children and young people, both online and offline. Although there are individual differences, when children and young people are under stress or anxious, they can show this in a variety of ways. This can include isolating themselves, not attending school or further education or engaging with online learning, changes in their emotional state, such as appearing fearful or withdrawn or having low self-esteem, changes in their behaviour, for example, becoming aggressive or challenging, changes in their body language, such as repeating movements over and over again. Other examples here might include affection seeking, over-friendliness, clinginess, demonstrating excessively good behaviour to prevent disapproval, failing to seek or accept comfort or affection when they're very distressed, showing controlling behavioural patterns, or a lack of ability to understand and recognise emotions. It's important when handling behavioural issues, online or offline, to look into what might be driving the behaviour before taking any further action. Difficulties at home and mental health needs might well be factors to consider. Some children and young people may appear fine, but they may be masking their worries. Where, for example, parents and carers raise concerns, it's worth bearing this in mind. They may seem fine in the classroom or online, but it may be a different story elsewhere. How do we listen carefully and well? Active listening is essential to understanding other people, and this slide provides some top tips around active listening. Listening well is key in building relationships and the whole recovery approach. You don't have to have all of the answers right now, but without good listening, everything else will fail. When thinking about active listening, it can be helpful to think about the following points. How do you acknowledge? For example, you might acknowledge that things feel difficult right now, or acknowledge a range of feelings such as anxiety, sadness, anger, frustration, disappointment, and so on. It's also important to normalize a range of feelings. You might say something along the lines of, "It's okay to feel like this. A lot of people do." In addition, it's also useful to provide some scaffolding to social support. An example of this might be the following statement. "I hear what you're saying. Maybe we can talk about possible solutions." Lastly, it's important to signpost, so you might help young people and children to think about what they can do. For example, you might say something like, "One thing we can do is X, Y, and Z. How do you feel about that?" This can help young people and children to think about the possible solutions, as well as the additional sources of support. Give young people and children space and time. Don't force them to talk and resist the urge to find a solution or to have all of the answers. If you don't know something, just say so and say you'll try to find out. You may wish to discuss and agree safe and appropriate ways of reassuring children and young people online and offline. For example, you may wish to consider how your body language, tone, and facial expressions come across. You may also need to exaggerate these so pupils or students can see them online, or if you're wearing masks. You may wish to use signals to reassure or show approval, such as a thumbs up sign, and maybe even include your class in doing this. This slide is all about making links or signposting. It highlights that you do not have to manage challenges on your own. Initially, it's worth checking who's around that individual, whether that's family, friends, or those that they trust, and whether this support is aware of how the individual is feeling. Encourage the person to open up and to seek comfort from their loved ones if this is appropriate, as this can be an important first step. Support in your school or further education provider can include senior leads, safeguarding leads, pastoral and wellbeing leads, learning mentors, your SENCOs, school nurses, peer support, and other trusted adults. Specialist support is also available should you need it. This can include education psychology, counsellors, emotional literacy support assistants or ELSAs, and other pastoral support, mental health support teams, children and young people's mental health services, GPs, speech and language therapists, adult mental health teams, social services, local authority education and learning services, voluntary and community sector organisations, and youth workers. These organisations may also be able to support you with signposting to other relevant services. When making referrals, provide as much information as you can to help organisations establish how best to proceed. There are also online services and tools to help people remotely, such as online counselling or wellbeing apps. When thinking about signposting, it's important to think about a range of support options, both inside and outside of your school or further education provider. Make yourself aware of resources, including self-help resources. You might also want to consider linking in with local or national communities, including online communities. The list that you develop will depend upon what's available locally, and it's not an exhaustive list. It's also important that services and resources are age appropriate for your pupils or students. If you're not sure about whether you're well placed to signpost a pupil or a student, then speak to your senior mental health lead, pastoral or wellbeing lead, SENCO and/or designated safeguarding lead, as they may be able to advise you or to provide a list of resources. They may also be able to make some suggestions if these aren't already available to you. We have provided links to some free, nationally available resources for education staff and children and young people and their families alongside this webinar, which may be helpful for you. Remember that signposting is an active process. The more you listen carefully, the more likely you'll be able to refer someone to appropriate support. Guiding someone to a good resource is empowering, and the aim of good signposting is to help that individual to build their coping strategies and to build their resilience. You might see increased or different wellbeing and mental health needs amongst your pupils or students when schools and further education providers reopen fully. Knowing what resources are out there will help you to prepare. We will now introduce an activity to help you to discuss what you've learnt so far and how you might apply this learning when working with pupils, students, families, as well as yourselves and your colleagues. Look, Listen, Link can be applied to a range of scenarios and across your whole school or further education community. This activity should take about 10 to 15 minutes. Discuss how you could usefully apply the Look, Listen, Link model to pupils, students, or colleagues that you work with. You could explore the barriers and opportunities of working online, as well as socially distanced teaching or bubbles. You may wish to think about the following: how you might spot warning signs online or in pupils or students that you don't usually work with, whether you could have wellbeing check-ins with pupils and students if you don't do so already, how you might build in moments to check in with colleagues remotely during this extremely busy time. Please ensure that when you're having these discussions, you aren't using any identifying information. It's also important to refer back to your group agreement as highlighted on slide 4. If you wish to, you can use the example of the case study Anita, which is on the next slide, in order to support your discussions. Please pause the webinar here or once you've reviewed the Anita case study to complete this activity. This is the case study of Anita. Before the pandemic, Anita seemed happy and outspoken and was doing well in class. Anita has stayed home during each lockdown. When Anita returned to school or further education last term, her attendance had dropped. She was quiet in class, she seemed down and isolated, and she had lost weight. Anita now joins in online classes, but her attendance is still patchy. Sometimes she doesn't even turn her camera on. Recently, one of Anita's teachers noticed a bruise on her cheek. Given this, there are now safeguarding concerns as well as concerns about Anita's mental health. Things seem to be getting worse, not better. What can your school or further education provider do to help Anita? This brings us to the end of this webinar. We hope you have found this session interesting and helpful to you in your work with pupils or students and their families, as well as your colleagues and yourselves. Thank you for taking the time to engage with and work through this session, and for your incredible efforts to support our communities throughout this extremely challenging and uncertain time. For further information, advice and support, we've included a list of freely available information and resources alongside this webinar. Please note that these lists are not exhaustive, but they are a great starting point.